3 and
again.
Good morning, dear colleagues, dear friends. It's really a great pleasure to start the second day of our workshop. We had a first day yesterday full of discussions. We had the participation of our international guests, and today we continue our activities in the second International Structural Development Macroeconomics workshop. And for me, again, it's a great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker, our guest for this second day. It is Professor Germana Giombini, that I have the pleasure to be a friend and a co-author. Professor Germana, she's professor at the University of Urbino in Italy. She holds a PhD in economics from the University Politecnica delle Marche, also in Italy, and is co-editor of the International Journal of Applied Behavioral Economics. She has really an extensive list of contributions that range, from topics covering innovation and real financial market interactions, and also sustainability, with a particular emphasis on how attitudes and behavioral issues influence the way economic agents and business organizations interact. She has an extensive list of publications in important journals, such as the Regional Studies, Economic Modeling, Causalities and Fractals, and so on and so forth. Today she will talk about monetary policy and climate change. That, again, is in the frontier of the debate and the discussion at the international level. How fiscal and monetary policies, and in the case of her talk, how monetary policies can be directed or can be used to tackle, to face one of the greatest challenges of our generation, maybe the greatest challenge of our generation, that is climate change. So Germana, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. Thank you very much for being with us. And without further ado, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Marvil. Thank you, José. Thank you to everybody. It's an honor for me to be here. And it was a great pleasure to receive this invitation. So as you said, my talk, so I'm going to share my presentation. As you said, my talk is on monetary policies and climate change. Actually, I was thinking that maybe I should have called it climate change and monetary policies. As we will see, we will start from we will start from the impact of climate change on economics, and then on the stability of financial systems, and then we will discuss the issue of how central authorities, central banks should behave in to consider the potential risks due to climate change into monetary policies. So a brief introduction of this talk. First of all, in 2017, the Network for Greening Financial Systems was based by 8 central banks and supervisors that agreed to collectively commit to establish this network to green the financial systems. The network was initially composed by Banco de Mexico, Bank of England, Bank de France, Deutsche Bank, the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and the People's Bank of China, among others. And in 2018, the network claimed that climate-related risks are a source of financial risk. It is therefore within the mandates of central banks and supervisors to ensure the financial system is resilient to these risks. As for the most recent data, we have that at last April 13, the network consisted of 114 members and 18 observers. And so this network was the first to recognize the importance of climate change into monetary policies. And actually the aim of the network was to help strengthen the global response needed to meet the goals of the Paris Agreement, and to strengthen the role of the financial systems to manage risk and mobilize capital for green and low carbon investments in the broader context of environmentally sustainable development. Indeed, we have that climate change is one of the main sources of structural change and impacts into the financial systems. And this impact has peculiar characteristics. First of all, the impact is of far-reaching magnitude. Climate change affects all agents in the economy, that is, consumers, households, firms, businesses, governments, in all sectors and in all geographic areas. And the dynamics are potentially non-linear. The nature of the impact is predictable. It is that, indeed, while the quantification or the horizon, the time horizon or the future pathway are uncertain, there is a high degree of certainty that some combination of physical and transitional risks will materialize in the future. We will discuss later about physical risk and transition risk related to climate change. And the impact of climate change is irreversible. So irreversibility is an additional peculiarity of climate change into the economy. Finally, we have that the impact is path dependent. There is a dependence on on the actions taken in the short time. So the magnitude and the nature of future impacts will be determined also by action taken today. So given these important characteristics of climate change and of its impact into the financial systems, this talk will focus, first of all, on climate change and how on the two types of risks associated to climate change, physical risk and transition risk. Then the impact of climate change on the economy. So what are the transmission channels? So we'll see supply shocks, demand shocks, and the impact on the aggregate variables, output, inflation, prices. And then we turn to focus to the relationship between risks and financial stability. First, physical risks and financial stability. And we see how physical risks affect financial stability and how financial stability could affect the economy. And then transition risks and financial stability. In the last part of the talk, I will focus on climate change and monetary policies. So why monetary policy should take into account and how should take into account climate change. And there will be a brief discussion about what the ECB is doing and what the Central Bank of Brazil is doing. And then we will conclude. So climate change impacts the economy and financial stability through two channels, physical risk and transition risk. Physical risk arise from the interaction between higher average temperatures, more frequent weather extremes, and exposure and vulnerability of society and economic systems to these hazards. Physical risks can be divided, moreover, into two categories: gradual global warming and the associated changes, such as the sea level rise or changes in the precipitation patterns, and secondly, natural disasters, such as hurricanes, floods, and heat waves. As for transition risk, here we are referring to the risks associated to the transition of the economic system to climate neutral economic systems. Both these risks impact on the global economies with a heterogeneous and increasing severity of effects that is expected to increase since the second half of this century. So these are the mechanism through which physical risks and transition risks affect the economy. So gradual warming and extreme events are the two kinds of risks, of physical risks, and then we have transition risks. We start by considering supply shocks, and then we focus on demand shock. So the transmission mechanism can affect the economy through different channels: labor supply, food, energy, and other input supply, capital stock, effect on technology, and effect on productivity. According to the kind of risk, that is gradual warming, extreme events, or transition risks, the effects can be different. For example, if we consider labor supply, we have that gradual warming affect labor supply and then the supply by a loss of hours worked due to extreme temperatures, by increasing international migration. Extreme events imply the destruction of workplace and the need to migrate, even if temporarily, not necessarily for longer periods. The transition risks imply changes in sectoral composition of labor market that could lead to higher structural unemployment. As for food, energy, and other inputs, the supply of these inputs can be affected by global warming, by a decline in agricultural productivity and yields. Extreme events imply the disruption to transport and production chains. Capital stock. Capital stock is affected by gradual warming, implying a diversion of resources from productive investment to adaptation capital. In the case of extreme events, we have the destruction due to these extreme events. As for the transition to a low carbon economy, we have a rise in stranded assets. The issue of stranded assets is a hot issue in this period. With the stranded assets, we intend assets that have suffered from unanticipated or premature write-down, devaluation, or conversion to liability due to the transition. As for technology, we have that the gradual warming imply diversion of resources to reconstruction activity. In the case of extreme events, the same happens. As for transition risk, we have that climate policies are a potential driver of innovation. So in this case, we might have positive effect on technology related to transition risks. Finally, we have the effect on productivity. Lower labor productivity can be due to extreme heat waves and lower human capital accumulation. Why? Because there are also issues related to health and mortality. In the case of extreme events, this is especially true. And we also have infrastructure destruction. When we look at transition risk, we have uncertain effect on productivity because technological progress could offset underinvestment resulting from transition policies. So there is a trade-off in this case. When we look at the demand side, again, we have different elements that are involved, from energy demand to investment to consumption and trade. Again, the first column refers to gradual warming, the second column to extreme events, so the first two columns are related to physical risks. The third column is related to transition risk. So we have that when we look at energy demand, gradual warming implies an increased demand for electricity in summer that exceeds the decreased demand in winter. Policy-induced shift to renewable energy reduces demands for fossil fuel. When we look at the transition risk, we have that higher carbon tax leads to lower demand for fossil fuel. When we look at investment, we have a change in preferences toward more sustainable goods and services. And this is true when we look at physical risks and also when we look at transition risks. When we look at extreme events, we also have more uncertainty and investment could be delayed. And investment in reconstruction increases following these extreme events. When we look at the transition risk, we also have a shift in the mix of activity toward more investments, and we have also uncertainty about climate policy that might reduce investment. If we look at consumption, so the impact of consumption, we have, first of all, a change in preferences towards more sustainable goods and services. In the case of extreme events, we might have permanent decrease in wealth and thus negative effects on consumption. In the special case, in the common case actually, if insurers of households or firms following the instruction. And if we look at transition risk, third column, we have increased sustainability awareness and thus a shift toward greener consumption. Finally, trade. We have disruption to trade routes due to geophysical changes, for example, as a consequence, for example, of rising sea levels, changes in food prices and disruption to trade flows in the case of extreme events. If we look at transition risks, we have that taxes, regulations, and restrictions could unsettle trade routes. Risks of distortions from asymmetric or unilateral climate policies. So we see that the shocks, the kind of risks, the different kind of risk might affect the economy through different channels, both through supply channels and demand channels in different ways, in heterogeneous and different ways. When we look at the aggregate impact, we could focus on output, wages, inflation, and inflation expectations. As for output, we have that physical risks are associated to lower labor productivity, investment being diverted to mitigation and arable land loss, to physical destruction, for example, crop failures, destruction of facilities and infrastructures, then disruption of supply chains, and this is for physical risks. If we look at transition risk, the fractions might result from distortive fiscal transition policies and or transition policy uncertainty. And the impact could be mitigating depending on the use of proceeds from fiscal transition policies. As for wages, we have a downward pressure of wages from lower productivity. As productivity might become lower, wages will reduce. We might have unequal effects across sectors and economies when we look at extreme events, and also when we look at the transition. If we look, so third column, if we consider transition risk, we have that the reallocation of workers from one sector to another affect unequally sectors and economies. Finally, we have impact on other nominal variables such as inflation and also inflation expectations. And here we have that the relative price changes are due to shifting consumer demand or preferences, and changes also in comparative cost advantages through more sustainable goods with respect to less sustainable goods. When we consider extreme events, we have increased inflation volatility, particularly in food, housing, and energy prices. And if we look at the transition risks, in this case, we have that prices are affected by climate-related transition policies, policy uncertainty, technological change, and shifts in consumer preferences. In terms of expectations, climate-related shocks might affect inflation expectation in unpredictable ways, thus, as we will see, affecting the transmission channels of monetary policy. So here, up to now, we have seen how risks related to climate change affect the economy, but then we have that these risks may affect financial stability directly and indirectly. So as for physical risks, we have that the financial system is exposed to physical risks that are actually related to the lack of incisive action to combat climate change and transition risks. And we have already said that transition risk means risks related to the transition to a low carbon economy. And central banks are increasingly interested in understanding how climate risks translate into financial risks and how adverse climate events can propagate within the financial system. As for physical risk, we have that physical risk involve financial intermediaries, both directly, for example, damaging a banking institution's branches, and indirectly, for example, affecting bank customers who may then fail to honor the financial commitment, implying possible losses on banks' balance sheets, liability risks, and a consequent credit crunch. Indeed, the increased risk due to climate change could lead banks to restrict credit to those customers located in the most at-risk areas, with potential negative repercussions on the transmission of monetary policy impulses as well, not only in the economy, but also monetary policy. This figure explain how the transmission goes from the physical risk to financial system. The drivers of physical risks are generally the extreme weather events and the gradual changes in climate, so extreme events and gradual changes. These physical risks firstly affected the economy. We have already seen business disruption, capital scrapping, reconstruction and replacement, increase in commodity price, migration of labor force, and the direct transmission channel goes from the economy to the financial system by lowering the residential property values, by lowering the commercial property values, by lowering household wealth, and by lowering corporate profitability and increased litigation. What is the effect on financial? What are the effects on financial system? We might have financial market losses in terms of loss of values of equities, bonds, and also commodities. We might have credit market losses. We have underwriting losses, and finally, operational risk. The financial system then can affect the economy as well. So we have a vicious cycle that goes from the physical risk to the economy to the financial system and go back to the economy again. So we have that a wider economic deterioration, lower demand, productivity, and output impact on financial conditions. Then we have that financial contagion feeds back the economy. Then we have transition risks. Also, transition risks might affect financial stability. In particular, we have that when the transition is ungoverned, when the transition to a low carbon economy is ungoverned, it could abruptly reduce the value of energy reserves and infrastructure related to the exploitation, processing, and use of fossil fuel, coal, oil, and gas. A sudden drop in the value of reserves and related infrastructure could trigger a rush to sell off energy company stocks, with consequences that could affect the global economic growth path. And as we have already said, the focus here is mainly on stranded assets. We have that the most exposed sectors are coal and hydrocarbon-related sectors, utilities, steel and cement production, and sectors related to the transportation systems. Recently, there are models that try to quantify this risk by a combination of hazard, exposure, and vulnerability. For example, there is a model for the exposure of the financial system to physical and transitional risk, and the study from Banco of Italy shows that the exposure of the Italian financial system to physical risk is estimated as the 28% of total loans, while transitional risk is estimating between 7.5 and 13% of total assets. This figure again, these figures are taken from the last report of the Network for Green the Financial System, and shows how we go from transition risk drivers to the economy to the financial system. The transition risk is mainly related to climate policy, technology, and consumer preferences, and it affects the economy through stranded assets, especially those assets related to fossil fuel, real estate, infrastructure, and vehicles, reinvestment and replacement, and increasing energy price. The direct transmission channels goes from the economy to financial system by affecting corporate asset devaluation, lower corporate profitability and increasing litigation, lower residential property values, lower household wealth. So we see that some components are, for example, lower household wealth or lower residential property values are related to both kinds of risk, while others are peculiarly related to the specific kind of risk that we are considering. Then the effect on the financial system is mainly on financial market losses and on credit market losses. And again, we have that a wider economic deterioration impacts the financial condition, but then we also have that the financial contagion feeds back to the economy. So, given this risk, we see that the risks affect the financial stability, might affect the financial stability of the systems, and affect the transmission of monetary policy through financial market and the banking sector, particularly through asset stranding and standard repricing of climate-related financial risk. And we have that if the financial system is weakened, the transmission of monetary policy may be impaired. There are several risks related to climate change that may imply reduction in the natural interest rate, in addition to the factors that have already driven its secular decline in recent decades. On the other hand, we have that greater demand for transition investments and innovation-related increase in productivity might push the natural interest rate upward. Then there are two opposite forces, and the net effect of these two opposite forces is ex-ante uncertainty. However, we may say that if the forces restraining the natural rate prevail, the refinancing rate would approach to the effective lower bound, limiting the monetary policy space for conventional instruments, so leading the economy to a liquidity trap. Then, moreover, we might have that climate risks might hinder the proper identification of shocks relevant to the medium-term inflation outlook and increase the trade-off between growth and price stabilization objectives. Moreover, we have that uncertainty about the magnitude of the effects of climate change at the time horizon over which they manifest themselves in the economy can exacerbate these effects. And we also have briefly said about inflation expectations So if we have physical risks, transition risks, and the impact of climate change through the transmission mechanisms of monetary policy depends on the kind of risk that we are considering. So the transmission mechanisms consider different channels. We have the interest rate channels, we have the credit channel, the asset price channel, exchange rate channel, and expectation channel that are the main channels through which monetary policy affect the economy. We have that physical risks affect the interest rate channel by considering non-interest cost factors that become more relevant, lowering investments and saving response to interest rate changes. When we consider the transition risk from carbon pricing and reducing emissions, we have that uncertainty about the timing and speed of policy responses raises risk premium and volatility, affecting also the natural interest rate. If we consider the credit channel, we have that financial losses reduce borrower net worth, bank collateral, and profitability. Non-performing loans constrain credit supply. Uncertainty reduce market funding on banks, thus affecting the credit channel and implying also potentially a credit crunch reduction of credit. And when we consider transition risk, we have that financial losses reduce borrowers' net worth, bank collateral, and profitability as well. Again, non-performing loans that are those loans for which the probability of default is very large, constrain credit supply. Uncertainty reduce market funding of banks. When we consider the third channel, the asset price channel, we have that when physical risk destroy capital and residential property, thus there are financial losses that lower firm valuations. And this has an effect also on collateral, that the firms can bring to the bank to obtain credit. And as when we consider the transition risk, we have the demand shifts across sectors and regions, affect the asset price channels. And again, an important issue is related to the stranded assets, that are those assets that have suffered from unanticipated write-down, loss of value. Then we have the exchange rate channel, a higher volatility of the exchange rate, the valuation incentives for short-term competitiveness gain. When we look at physical risk, when we consider transition risk, we have that carbon border adjustment might disrupt trade routes and the global value chain. Finally, the expectation channel, that is far last but not least among the channels, imply that monetary policy is less predictable since the shock's persistence is uncertain. There is a blurring of supply and demand. Time inconsistent transition policies reduce monetary policy credibility. And we know that the credibility of central banks is central for the implementation of the monetary policies and effectiveness of forward guidance. That is a key issue, for example, in the European conduction of monetary policy. Here in this graph, we have an example of shrinking space for the monetary policy. So in this graph, this is a simulation taken from the ECB. From the report, there are references at the end of the presentation. The report is of last September. And in this simulation, we see that if we consider the impact of climate change, we have that climate change reduce monetary policy space in the measure that goes from the blue curve to the red curve. That means reducing the possibility of using interest rate as an instrument. Okay, so very quickly, we might also have the different scenario and a differentiated impact on inflation, on inflation and GDP growth. And these two graphs show that when the graph B, when the chart B, when the transition is disorderly, the deviation of core inflation from core inflation and from the objective GDP growth are larger. And so we have that ECB is actually taking into account climate change. Climate change has been recognized as a global challenge and a policy priority for European Union, and within its mandate for the ECB. So the ECB has taken into consideration, is taking into consideration more measures, for example, development of new macroeconomic models, development of new experimental indicators, disclosure requirements for the eligibility of submission of collateral and asset purchase, enhancements of risk assessment capacity. So banks are also considered a stress test related to climate risk, collateral system, purchase of corporate sector's assets, and adjustment of corporate purchase allocation system to corporate climate change criteria. If we look at the Banco Central do Brasil, we have that climate events bring considerable risk for the entire Brazilian national financial system stability and are responsible for changes in the macroeconomic backdrop and economy that affect the monetary policy. The first report of the Banco Central do Brasil, that is of last September, analyze such events as potential changes in currency demand and important financial costs can be estimated for the whole society. And the Financial Stability Commitment, the Monetary Policy Committee, are the authority in the Banco Central do Brasil that have to take into account these risks. In particular, we have that the focus is on the international reserves, and while there are still no consolidated methodologies and metrics in the literature and international market as the best practices to climate risk assessments to building investment portfolios, there is an effort, beside this, there is an effort for investors in the institutions to monitor and disclosure the climate risk to the of their financial positions based on existing standards. So what the Banco Central de Brasil does, monitor metrics associated with greenhouse gas emission that are constructed based on carbon emissions, CO2, and equivalent emissions. The monitoring of these metrics aims to assess the impact of the different investment strategies on the portfolio carbon profile. And the point is that as the international reserves portfolio is mostly invested in sovereign bonds, not in corporate assets, the monitor of indices and metrics associated with the portfolio is predominantly influenced by the indicators associated with countries rather than companies. This graph shows a theoretical portfolio of central banks and the weighted average of carbon intensity of international reserves. So this graph shows a reduction of this weighted average that simply means a drop in countries' carbon emissions as the denominator as it is carbon emissions related to GDP. To conclude, Climate risk can affect the soundness of intermediaries and the stability of the financial systems, and hinder the transmission channels of monetary policy on the one side and price stability on the other. Looking forward, central banks' intervention in the economy will need to consider climate change and its economic implication. And actually, central banks' intervention are starting to considering this climate change. There is a green finance paradigm. That means assets with higher sustainability scores are, in the long run, more resilient to shocks, and as a result can provide better combinations of risk and return, benefiting investors and society as a whole. So this is the bibliography. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Germana, for
Thank
such
you.
such an interesting talk and such an important talk above all. So now we can open the floor for questions for our friends that are following on YouTube, but for the members of the group that are also following on Zoom. Please, I know that Professor Oreiro wanted to ask at least a couple of questions because he already told me so.
All right, Margaret, thank you. Thank you, Germana, for your beautiful presentation, very interesting, and made me to think about some issues of monetary policy. The first question is related with the monetary policy regimes. As you know, both the European Central Bank and the Brazilian Central Bank adopted from many years the inflation targeting regime. The basic premise of the inflation targeting regime is, in the words of Ben Bernanke, the existence of a so-called divine coincidence. The idea is that is it possible to stabilize inflation as well as output? The divine coincidence is based on the assumption that the main source of shocks over an economy are demand shocks. So when you have a positive demand shock, inflation, output will raise, but also inflation will raise. So the central bank can reduce inflation and to stabilize output near the potential level just by raising interest rates. When the reverse occurs, when you have a negative demand shock, so the output drops, but also inflation, and then central bank can stabilize the economy just reducing interest rates in order to increase output and to increase the inflation to the target level. Okay, but I think that both the pandemic of COVID-19 and now the war at Ukraine shows to every central bank in the world that the divine coincidence is just historical curiosity. You know, our countries, Brazil, I just see now the accumulated inflation in 12 months, it's 11 and 73% in 12 months. Yeah. Although we have raised the short-term interest rate from 2% in March of 2021 to 12.75% last month. There is an increase of 1,000 basis points in just 1 year. But the inflation inflation in Brazil have dropped from April to May, not because of the interest rate change, but because we had a reduction on the inflation of electricity, because the rainings in the last year were very good, and now the price of energy could be lower in April. That's basically why the accumulated inflation between April and May have reduced more or less 100 points. So based on your presentation, I think that climate changes had a clear negative effect, a supply shock effect. You know, it will reduce the potential output, reduce productivity, and etc., etc. Well, the impact over demand is not clear. It can be positive or can be negative, but I bet that at least in the first stages will be negative. So we have a possible combination of a negative supply shock and a negative demand shock. So what the central bank will do, that's precisely what is occurring now. Both in Europe, United States and Brazil, inflation is increasing, but it is increasing due to supply shock factors. The president of the European Central Bank, Madame Christine Lagarde, says a couple of months ago that inflation in Europe is imported, so there is nothing that the Central Bank of Europe can do to fight an inflation that's a cost inflation imported from outside Europe. No? And I think that it's probable that the European Central Bank will keep nominal exchange rate negative until for a couple of months. So that's the point. What will remain of the inflation targeting regime in a world where there is no divine coincidence? Much on the contrary, the central bank will face a persistent situation of negative supply shock that will increase food prices, that will increase energy prices, and a negative demand shock that will decrease aggregate demand, that will decrease employment, and so on and so forth. I think that in this scenario, returning to the older debate of rules versus discretion, I think that the best policy that the central banks all over the world can adopt is to return to the old Keynesian idea of fine-tuning the economy, to use discretionary policy. That's my comments for now. Many thanks.
Thank you. Marvin, can I talk?
Marvin, you are the chair.
Yes, please,
okay.
Giovanna, yes.
Okay. I completely agree with you, actually, with your points. And this is also, I believe, the view of the European Central Bank. Indeed, as you said, the European Central Bank is not changing its monetary policy. I mean, it is not, the European Central Bank is not renewing the asset purchase programs, but is not increasing anymore the asset purchase program, the quantitative easing and all the forms related to quantitative easing, but is not increasing interest rates. So we have that the deposit facility is still minus 0.50. The main refinancing operation interest rate is 0, and the marginal lender facility is 0.25, even if the inflation at May, the estimated inflation is 8.1%. I was looking on annual base. But the approach of the European Central Bank has been different from, for example, the approach of, and even if there is a debate, on which is the best way to answer to this inflation. But the idea is that the inflation is mainly an inflation driven by supply shocks, not from the demand. And the risk is that with a tight monetary policy, so with an increase in interest rates, the effect, this monetary policy would affect more the output than prices. So this is why the European Central Bank is not changing yet its rating. And in this respect, we also have that in Europe, the inflation, the main objective of the European Central Bank has changed. So until some months ago, the objective was the target, the main goal of the European Central Bank is an inflation rate close but below the 2%. Now the target is an inflation rate on average close to the 2% in the medium run. So if we consider the medium run, the fact that until some months ago, the inflation was actually negative, the European Central Bank is still considering that in the medium run, the inflation target is still reached. So yeah, I agree with your points. And of course, I think that monetary policy has become a powerful instrument for governing economic changes and structural changes of the economy, but monetary policy alone are not enough. For example, in Europe, we need fiscal policy coordinations as well. Otherwise, monetary policy alone cannot face these important challenges that are facing our economy. But I completely agree with your point.
Thank you. And if you allow me to jump in with my question, and we are running a little bit of time, so I'll try to be brief. Do you think, Germana, based on your talk, on your research you're doing, is it possible to adjust the current framework, the Taylor rules or the inflation target rules that we have now to accommodate this climate change, or do you think, or do you see in the next years central banks adopting more a green quantitative easing approach, or something that resembles a green quantitative easing? And you mentioned in your reply to Oreiro the need to coordinate fiscal and monetary policy. What kind of coordinations do you think we should expect, or do you see as desirable for these next years?
Yeah, I think that the issues related to climate change and challenges for the monetary policy, new monetary policy is really interesting, and there could be a lot of variety of different policies that could be undertaken. For example, I was looking at the research from the Banco Central de Brasil, and the analysis on the international reserves according to the emission of the countries is really interesting. Another aspect is the accommodation, could be the accommodation of a Taylor rule that takes into account the climate change, so different kind of firms and outputs, sustainable output growth or not. And also central banks could affect firm transition to a low carbon emissions by quantitative easing, in the measure that these the purchase of green bonds could affect the return of the bonds, and so the cost of financing of green firms as opposite to non-green firms. So yes, I think that these could be important topics, and are actually important topics at the study of central banks, and also of our study as researchers. And the coordination, I think at a coordination of fiscal and monetary coordination that implies policies that go in the same direction. For example, policies that foster the transition to a low carbon emission, both by incentives like to green firms, and by actually a carbon tax on brown firms. And I think that the coordination of monetary and fiscal policies is central for the transition. And also it should be also at the international level, because the climate change is, is typical an externality of the system.
Thank you. We have one question from Daniel Moura. We would like to share with you. From Paulo Mibielli. I hope I pronounced it correctly. Paulo Mibielli. He's asking, Germana, does the Brazilian central bank stand out among developing countries for its concern with climate change?
Actually, the Brazilian central bank is one of the main banks in the network for greening financial systems, and I think that the Brazilian central, when we look at how central banks behave, I mean, if we look at what the program of the European Central Bank with respect to climate change is, there is a timetable of the program, a clear timetable for this year, next year, until 2024. But there is, but again, also the Brazilian Central Bank is starting considering, importantly, even if, as they said in the report, there is not a unique way of considering the optimal portfolio choice, the unique way of considering which metric to consider. But again, the European Central Bank is considering as well the how to implement climate change among other sustainable development goals. And as for the second questions, I should, I actually cannot have I cannot predict how long. I think all dominate the world energy mix. I cannot answer to this. I know this
is a $1 million question, right?
Yeah,
to know the answer, because we need that answer to solve the whole climate change situation. So if we don't have other questions,
I just have an observation to do.
Okay.
I think that the Brazilian Central Bank should look more at the example of the European Central Bank regarding inflation. You know, I told to the Brazilian press every time that I can that look what Christine Lagarde speaks about how to fight this kind of inflation. You know, you can push interest rates to wherever you want, wherever level you want. You will not reduce this kind of inflation, inflation of food and energy by just raising the interest rates. We have this month, as I told you, reduction in the accumulated inflation in 12 months from April to May, but mainly due to the reduction on the electricity prices, because we changed the so-called flags of energy system from red to green, because the reservoirs of water of our hydroelectric plants are plenty of water, and so we can reduce more or less 30% the electricity price from April to May. My bill just arrived yesterday, and I take an immense surprise that I have to pay basically 1/3 that I paid in April. So this has nothing to do with the interest rate. The central bank cannot control the raining. So it's an absolutely insane policy that costs a lot of money for the government, because in Brazil, we have more or less 50% of the public bonds is indexed to the short-term interest rates. So when the Brazilian Central Bank increases interest rate, the cost of public debt immediately increase because of this kind of indexation. And now I think that although we have less than 80% of our GDP as public debt, this year we will pay 7% of our GDP as interest services. So I think that we have to change the whole framework of the monetary policy in Brazil to eliminate indexation of public bonds, eliminate indexation of the economy in order to have a more low and stable inflation and to have civilized interest rates, because the level of interest rates in Brazil is absolutely insane for the last 30 years, and that's a major concern of Brazilian economy. But that's just some observation. Many thanks, Germana, for your beautiful and interesting presentation.
No, thank you to you. Thank you. It was really an honor for me. Thank you.
Thank you for staying with us, Germana. And now we'll go for a short break, 10 to 15 minutes, and we will continue with our next sessions in the workshop.
Ordinary sections. Ordinary sections. And don't. It's just an advice. Who can the Europeans that could see on our afternoon, there will be a special section of the Embassy of India about India's development model. I think that will be very interesting. All right. Bye-bye.
See you later, guys. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Have we stopped the transmission?